and view the captioning that way. If you're participating on a desktop computer, you can resize so that you can view both the webinar room and the stream text option, but that does require you to have a second browser option. There is also captioning available within the Zoom platform. Zoom has done some good work in enhancing the captioning features within the webinar platform room. So you can click on the captioning icon, you can mouse over the captioning icon, and you can resize and move that captioning window wherever you want to place it within the webinar room. And then there's also an option to view the full transcript of the captioning so that you can see the entire captioning transcript as the session moves along. So there are several options, several different ways to access the captioning. The stream text link is posted in the chat area. So if you don't have that, you can click on it there. It's also for future, it is posted in the email reminder that goes out in advance. Also, materials are available through your ADA audio conference account. The link to Box and accessing those materials is also posted in the chat area, so you'll see that link posted in there as well. All right, submitting questions. We use the question and answer area for questions for the speaker. So be sure that if you have something that you'd like Dr. Stafford to address when we get to the Q&A portion of the session, please make sure to submit those the questions in that area. Do not submit questions in the chat area. There will be a point early on in Dr. Stafford's presentation where we will where he will be seeking comments from participants, and at that point, those will be, you can submit those in the chat area, but for questions, those need to be submitted in the Q&A area. So anything that you want to be addressed, that needs to be in the Q&A area. We ask that you do not comment or respond to anyone else's post, either in the Q&A area or in the chat area. That becomes disruptive to other participants as well as the speaker. So please refrain from doing that. And we do reserve the right to remove anyone that uses the chat area inappropriately. If you're connected by phone and unable to submit questions, you can email your questions to webinars@adaconferences.org. And we will read those questions to Dr. Stafford when we get to that point. Again, webinars@adaconferences.org. If you're listening by telephone, you can submit your questions that way. If you require any technical assistance during today's session, a couple different options to get assistance. You can go to the chat area and you can send a private chat message to the host. So you can select the host from the drop-down menu in the chat area. Or again, you can send an email to webinars@adaconferences.org. So again, if you have any technical difficulties, you can submit that in the chat area, send a private message to the host, or you can submit email to webinars@adaconferences.org. All right. At this time, I'm going to ask you, Dr. Stafford, if you go ahead and share your screen at this point.
Is that working?
Looks good. We have about 2 minutes, 1 minute actually, before we start the top of the hour.
I put this on full screen. How do I access my chat box? Maybe I shouldn't put it on full screen.
The Zoom chat, you just mouse across, I believe, the top, and you'll see the menu pops up.
Huh. When I play it in slideshow, it
yeah, across the top.
Here comes start. Huh. Oh, there it is. I found it. Thanks.
You got it? Okay.
Well, I got Q&A. Let me get chat here. Yeah, okay. we're good.
Yeah, and I'll take care of the Q&A area when we get to that.
I assume you don't see the chat box on my screen, or do you?
Nope, only the PowerPoint.
Okay.
All right, let me a minute. Peter, you can start the session. Recording is starting.
Welcome everyone to the March ADA audio conference series, Livable Communities for a Lifetime. The ADA audio conference series is a project of the ADA National Network, and it is coordinated by the Great Lakes ADA Center. My name is Peter Berg. I'm with the Great Lakes ADA Center, Project Coordinator of Technical Assistance, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's session. The ADA National Network is funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration on Community Living, National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. You can locate the regional ADA center that serves your state by visiting the National Network website, adata.org. And from the homepage there, you can locate your regional ADA center, and it provides you with contact information and a way to get in touch with your ADA center if you have questions. So we are very pleased that you have joined us this afternoon. We have a wonderful session and topic and incredible speaker joining us today. And we have Dr. Philip Stafford. He is an adjunct professor of in the Department of Anthropology at Indiana University. And he has a long career studying and presenting on the topic of livable communities. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Stafford here with us today. As a reminder, if you have questions while the session is ongoing, you can submit those questions while Dr. Stafford is doing his PowerPoint presentation in the Q&A area. Again, questions only in the Q&A area, and you can submit your questions anonymously if you choose to do so. But you can do those as we move along, and we will get to those at the end of the session. So at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Stafford, and I will turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be talking with you and with a number of people around the country today. I've been looking forward to this opportunity. I've had the pleasure of working with the Great Lakes ADA Center over the years and have great respect for Peter and the staff there. And before I retired 3 years ago, I spent 17 years as the director of the Center on Aging and Community at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. So I moved from a career primarily in aging to an environment that allowed us to look at the intersection between aging and disability. So that was very, very fulfilling. And in that context, we had the opportunity through Matt Norris, who may be on the call, to do some really great work with Great Lakes ADA Center, which is still supporting work in Indiana. My session today is not tightly scripted. I've been to webinars where you have 3 speakers in an hour and 15 minutes each, and they have to be sort of scripted to get through an hour. But we have a fair amount of time today, and so I'm kind of like following Boyle's law here. I expand to fill the space, and that's pretty typical for me. I'm not going to be riffing all throughout the session, but the Q&A will give us a chance to dig a little deeper into questions and comments that you may have. And I suspect there are many people on the call who already have experience and knowledge of livable communities. You may be working directly in that within that framework, or maybe working in a community where there's a livable community initiative. And so I don't presume that we don't have a lot of other expertise on this call, and hope we can incorporate that. It's a huge topic, and so it's almost impossible to cover it in a single webinar anyway. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about different models of livable communities and some definitions of livable communities. I want to talk about the relationship of the ADA movement and system to the newer livability movement. That may be a question that people have. How do the two parallel tracks relate to one another? They're not parallel, they intersect. I'm going to refer to a model of disability that underlies the concept and the work of livability that I think is very, very important, fundamental. Talk about why participation and asset-based social change is important. Again, something that probably a lot of you are familiar with and employ in your own work. Then I'm going to review a project in Indiana that brought together people with disabilities with older adults to engage in community advocacy for lifetime livable communities. And I think you'll find that interesting, and I'll make reference to a couple of publications that are available. Towards the end, I'm going to make brief reference to some other stories of change around livability that don't relate directly to the livability movement, are not necessarily framed in those terms, but I see as great examples of livable community efforts. So that's sort of where we're starting. Click, there we go. However, I want to start with a little game. The first question, which is what makes a community livable? And in front of you on your slide, there's an important visual. I'm sorry if some of you don't have complete access to the visual, but I'm hoping that in our discussion, it will become clear that we're pointing to aspects of livable communities that you are able to observe, hopefully, in your own community. And what you see is the cover of a workbook we developed through our center on livable communities. And there are, if you count closely, there are something around 36 different examples of a livable community in this poster. And what I'd like to do is invite you to make your own observations of elements that you see related to livability and put them on the chat board. And so as you write down your observations in very brief format, we will begin to gather a collection of ideas about livability that will be perhaps important to our discussion. So maybe I should start with one myself. One of my favorites is mixed use development. And by that, I mean, this is a downtown that exhibits a number of different uses, from coffee shop to cinema to grocery store to community center to government services, all in one place. And urban planners would refer to that as mixed use development. Those of you who are ADA coordinators within municipalities are certainly familiar with this concept. But that's pretty fundamental to the whole discussion of livability, and one that I wanted to point out initially. Let's see. Okay, good. We got a whole list here. Let's see. We've got sidewalks and curb cuts. It's a walkable community. We have public transportation, specifically some sort of light rail. We also have, of course, a bus that has an accessible lift. There are opportunities for recreation in the community. Somebody pointed to the raised garden beds. Those are great. There's an accessible basketball court. Person with a wheelchair playing basketball with someone on the basketball court. Green space, that's important. In a livable community, that people have access to nature, whatever form that might take. Sometimes green space gets poorly treated in urban planning, and where developers exert too much control over the urban development, sometimes green space is simply the residual space that they can't use on the coverage allotments that they have for a piece of property. And so they'll just put some grass down and maybe some shrubs and call it green space. And green space needs to be intentional and deliberate and adequate and defined by the users, not the developers. Multiple forms of transportation. There's a it's not a, I used to call it an Amigo when my mom had one of these. It's a four-wheeled electric cart. There's wheelchair transportation. There's the bus. There's automobiles. There's bicycle. There's, of course, walking, and whether it's with or without the aid of an assistive device. Those are all forms of transportation. And sometimes I would rather refer to transportation as mobility rather than transportation, because transportation has such a narrow definition for a lot of people. And any reference to public transit, sometimes expansion of public transit scares the dickens out of public officials because they know how costly it is. But walking is not costly. And so referring to transportation as mobility can build some awareness. Curb cuts, no changes in level without a curb ramp. Got some new ones here. I need to scroll down. Pardon me while I look through these. Boy, you have really produced a jillion of these. Okay, boy, I'm not even up to the one I stopped at. Okay, there's a park, there's public art, the cinema, the sports, the community gardens, a lady with a walker on the sidewalk. There's rooftop access for people, residents and others are able to employ the rooftop for socialization and recreation. The playground is inclusive. The doors are wide, the ramps to the homes. Get my cursor under control here. Walkability, connectivity, accessible bike lanes, and social engagement opportunities. If one is redundant, I might not voice yours if it's redundant. Or it's a complete neighborhood. You can live, work, and play here, which is just wonderful. Marked crosswalks, public art, person with a cane waiting for the train to cross, bike lanes. Planning meetings with transcript/cart services automatically included. Multimodal transportation, a ramp into the home, a fountain, not in a food desert. Benches to rest on. Let me look at one of those benches. You know, that the one bench that I'm looking at would be better off if it had arms on the side of it to enable people to more easily and safely rise up from the bench. But benches are critically important. Wide sidewalks without barriers. Availability of fresh foods. Wayfinding, good wayfinding elements. Properly marked crossings, accessibility, parking spots. There's maybe a library here that somebody noticed. Maintenance of accessible features, snow and ice removal in the winter. That's a really good one. Recycling bins, entertainment. Here's somebody that says she learned how to drive on an Amigo from her grandmother also. Ramp connecting a sidewalk to the front door of the home. The mural on the wall is beautiful. I think the woman portrayed in the mural is actually Sue Ellen Jackson Bonner, because she's wearing a hat. And Sue Ellen, who passed on last year, was the wonderful director of our Council on Disabilities in Indiana. We miss her dearly. And I think she's the one that commissioned this poster. I don't know whether she asked to be in it, probably not, but I think that's kind of fun. A centralized accessible parking spot, striped crosswalks. Community center is in the center. The availability of home care to allow for aging in place. Multi-generational living, interesting point. Solar panels. Someone says, is there a service animal? I can't see one. That's a good observation. But I think near the basketball court, I'm guessing that young girl who's accompanied by a dog, maybe that's a service animal. So you came up with, I don't know, maybe 60 or 70 of these. We have used this game in training workshops to talk when we talk about livability and give people the challenge of identifying those features of a livable community and thinking about how those features could be built into their own communities. So this is a great example of a lifetime community, which is a community that's livable for all ages and abilities. That's important. It's not just an accessible community, though it is. It's also a livable community. So some of the models of livability that are floating around have tried to identify the domains for targeting with livable community change. And this is one that we have used through our center in our training program. And it's basically a listing of domains. There's a Venn diagram in the middle that shows how these domains, or suggests that these domains are overlapping. And but they include recreational opportunities for all ages and abilities, social and cultural opportunities, housing for all ages and abilities, health and support services, education, employment, civic engagement, and mobility for all ages and abilities. And this is the kind of a Venn diagram that could be used at the community level to organize people into groups who may be interested in focusing on one domain or another. Because one of the problems and challenges of the livable community movement is to undertake holistic change in communities. And there are few, in my experience, that have been able to address change in every single one of these domains. But that's one model of a livable lifetime community. This is another model that may be familiar to you from AARP. And it actually grows out of the World Health Organization, which organized work around the concept of age-friendly communities a number of years ago, and has created an international age-friendly community network about, maybe 5-6 years ago. AARP entered into a partnership with the World Health Organization to disseminate and support the development of this model throughout the United States. It involves a kind of a variation on certification program. A community can become part of the age-friendly network when they commit to creating a livable community. And what's significant about AARP getting involved is that it has reframed the conversation away from strict notions of age-friendliness to livability for all ages and abilities. And so I think it's significant and valuable that AARP was, in a sense, willing to give up the siloed approach that focuses all of these things around aging to consider a broader approach to livability. Now in the United States, there are, I think, more than 200 communities that are AARP, part of the AARP Age-Friendly Network and the WHO network. If you're interested in learning more about livability, I do heavily recommend the AARP website on livability. You can Google AARP livability. You can go to aarp.org/livable, but almost daily through their Twitter account, they're disseminating information about livability. The website has an abundance of examples of livable community successes throughout the United States, many of them supported through the AARP Community Challenge Grant Program, which is still open for applications. I think it closes April 14th. These are not complicated applications, can be a wonderful starting place if you have a small or even a medium-sized project in your community around livability that you'd like to get some funding for. I really encourage you to look into that. You can see here that the WHO and AARP have identified 8 domains of livability, a little bit more detailed than the previous one, in that it focuses on outdoor spaces and buildings, transportation, I would prefer the word mobility, communication and information, civic participation and employment, respect and social inclusion, health services and community supports, social participation, which is different than civic participation, and housing. So these are the 8 domains around which much of the work through WHO and AARP has been conducted. I wanted to show you one more just because it's a little, in some ways, more action-oriented. It's not just identifying domains, but it identifies actions. So I like this livability framework that's been proposed by the American Institute of Architects. If you see somebody with an AIA after their name, that's the organization that's the certification that they have as an architect. Design on a human scale, and that's an imperative, not a noun. It's a verb. Design on a human scale. Encourage mixed-use development. Vary transportation options. Create a neighborhood identity. Protect environmental resources. Provide choices. Preserve urban centers, build vibrant public spaces, conserve landscapes, and that in the end, design matters. It really does. This is another framework to think about when you think about the different approaches to livability. And I would suggest if communities interested in getting into livable community work, they take a view of, look at all the different models of livability and choose one that seems to suit the local situation. Sometimes people will find out about an innovation and just leap onto the innovation without understanding that there are other approaches to the challenges ahead of us. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the ADA and its relationship to livability. ADA compliance doesn't always mean disability friendly. ADA, the service, the program, the institution the building or other entity under discussion is accessible for individuals with disabilities in a manner consistent with the ADA. That's a definition of what the Americans with Disabilities Act is trying to do, and it has done so much since its inception. A good example of ADA relative to the built environment is a Title III ramp of a ratio of 1 to 12. 1 inch elevation requires 12 inches in extension. And that's a minimum standard for what would be an accessible ramp in a public space. And you all know how very, very, very important that has been in helping change the character of the built environment throughout the country and throughout the world. In some ways, it's a minimum rather than a maximum. It's a basic requirement rather than, in that sense, a fuller opportunity. And in that sense, it's a floor, not a ceiling. And that's not a criticism of ADA, but it's an important characteristic of any public policy that needs to be developed, no matter what the topic area. Livability, on the other hand, refers to an atmosphere and environment that is inclusive of all people with disabilities, moreover, all ages and abilities. And so in a livable environment, a ramp might be 1 to 16 or 1 to 20. In other words, going above the minimum. And it may be fair to equate to talk about the differences between accessibility and universal design, in which livability in some ways leans towards universal design rather than just the question of accessibility. So it's the difference between a perhaps compliant ramp on the side or the back of a public building, as opposed to one entrance for all ages and abilities on the front of the building. And people have been learning about this and advocating for ramps that are not hidden away in the back of a building and stigmatized. But it's, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert on ADA, I think that's not necessarily a pure requirement. We can talk about that, people who know more than I do. So although the ADA exacts a professional obligation against discrimination, it cannot ensure that individuals possess unbiased views toward disability. It's great when awareness is built because of the ADA and local communities go beyond that, and that the contact with people with disabilities it ensures helps reduce the presence of unbiased views, but there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. So in some ways, the ADA and the Livable Communities movements also differ in their approach to change. With the ADA, advocacy is exceedingly important, including self-advocacy. I'm going to come back to that idea. Litigation becomes an important feature of change under the ADA. Assessment becomes important. In other words, matching the environment against the standards. And many communities, as you know, have teams of people, volunteers usually set up to do that. A lot of education, changes in public policy through the ADA coordinators and local commissions and governments, and the private practice of ADA. That's probably not the best phrase because it's actually public practice and not necessarily private practice. Under a Livable Communities framework, social change involves community development based on envisioning an environment that works for all ages and abilities and not just people with disabilities. Participation as an important tool for social change. Assessment, likewise assessment, public policy and practice. And I want to emphasize that these two approaches are not oppositional, but they're complementary. And ADA people involved primarily with the Americans with Disabilities Act and people involved primarily with the Livable Communities Act, Livable Communities movement really need to be collaborating, talking together and cooperating and identifying joint challenges they can to double the power they have at the local level. In fact, power is important to social change. And within the ADA framework, power sometimes relates to both the individual who's concerned about their own situation or special interests, groups of people that have special interests in accessibility, for example. And that has benefits and advantages. It's supported by law. Livable community advocates can't very often refer to law to promote change. The solutions can be very concrete, where a set of steps becomes a ramp. And self-advocacy is an important tool to try to achieve change in a community. And I don't want to say complaint-driven, but bringing up individual challenges that may not be fair becomes an important approach to power. There are some risks taking that approach to power in a community around these issues. There's a problem of tokenism, where government bodies will make a small change and claim then that that's what they've done to make their community more accessible. In fact, the changes sometimes are too minor and not holistic or major. Sometimes the people involved with these approaches to power can be seen as an annoyance or seen to be need to be placated. And sometimes it's a question of a single issue competing against others in the community. So accessibility in some ways may be competing against homelessness or affordability or environmental concerns. And so these issues become siloed into single issue groups. A livable community approach in some ways has advantages and disadvantages, but the focus there is on the collective or on the commons in the community, where change is supported by common interests across a wide range of people. The approach is to identify shared problems and solutions. And advocacy is not self-advocacy so much as community advocacy. And I'll refer to that difference in a little bit. There are risks. Sometimes livable community initiatives become diluted because they're too broadly framed. You can't really get a handle on it because everybody, of course, wants a livable community, and the issue is just too huge. Too much is being asked. And the silos in a community are just too powerful to bring together. Schools and healthcare systems are not collaborating strategically. Housing and health are two important issues that are too often separated in communities, and those silos are just too strong to bring down. And the other thing has to do with just the way in which change in the face of disability has been framed in our culture. And I use this poster from Jerry Lewis Telethon to exemplify the point I'm trying to make, where in the kind of the poster child approach to disability, overcoming disability becomes a question of individual overcoming. And somebody has to have special, unique star qualities to overcome the challenges of disability. And that's great when that happens. But that kind of skews the way we think about disability. And again, gives us an opportunity to celebrate individuals who overcome. But next year, we just celebrate a different group of individuals who overcome. And so I think we need to get beyond this particular notion of disability. In fact, this is maybe the most important statement in the webinar today, is that health and disability refer to the balance between personal capability and environmental demand. This is from a very famous article by Verbrugge and Jeté, 1993, called The Disablement Process. And I'm certain that many of you listening today are familiar with this particular model of disability, because it's very important and really underlies the whole notion of livable communities in my mind. This is the way I have said it with respect to aging, which has been my passion over the past 45 years. I've come to believe that aging is not about time and the body, but about relationships and the meaning of place. I'm hoping maybe you'll go away with that thought too. What I'm doing is identifying health and disability and aging as a relational concept. Disability as relational: I am disabled by distance. I am disabled by the slope. I am disabled by the number of stairs. I am disabled by the perceptions of others. We have come to talk about disability in a well-intentioned way by talking about having a disability. I have a disability. But in some ways, the phrase "I am disabled" perhaps is more compatible with this notion of environment and disability as a relational concept. I am disabled by the environment. And what this does is take disability out of the body and puts it in the nexus between the body and the environment. That's where disability lies. That's where aging lies. That's where health and illness lie. I'll close my talk today with a quote from Wendell Berry that provides a much more eloquent description of this. But you can see also that this notion of disability as a relational concept between the body and the environment politicizes disability. It shifts blame for the problem from the individual to the environment. And we begin to talk about environmental impairments and disabling environments. And that's a very useful way to think about community change in the context of disability and aging. And because it focuses on our relationship to the communities, trying to change the culture, change society, benefits by having people engaged together in a process of participation as equal members of a commons. And participation is an important approach to social change within the Livability's community movement. And this is the best definition I've come across of participation, which is that participation provides a collaborative process by which community inhabitants reach common goals, engage in collective decisions, and create places. And these places, in turn, serve as material expressions of their collective efforts. So participation becomes a very, very important tool in the livable community movement. There's a number of other reasons why participation is important. It helps counter the decline that we see in civic engagement around our country. It broadens accountability because more people are responsible for the decisions. It suggests that people really need to know fully the process and how they might fit in, and that public, quote, input meetings alone are unsatisfactory. I'm always chafing at the word input. when it's used by public officials. We took input from the community, and then we went into a room and decided what we were going to do. So don't be satisfied with the word input as the be all and end all of participation in your community. Participation enables us to work with a diverse public, people with diverse modes of learning and interpretation. It helps frame issues more clearly and more resonantly in the local context. The people need tools to be on an equal plane with the holders of power. And perhaps most important of all, participation builds the democracy with a small d. This is a famous image. It's a visual that shows what Sherry Arnstein called the ladder of participation. So you can see an image of a ladder with steps going from the bottom to the top. Step number one is manipulation of the public and what we might call therapy, doing not necessarily for others, but certainly to others as well. That's really non-participation. Then degree upwards on the ladder to degrees of tokenism, where we inform the public what we're going to do and call it participation. We may take public input and call it participation. Or we may placate the public and call it participation, try to persuade people that this is the right thing. Now, on the top three rungs of the ladder are more higher degrees of citizen power, ranging from partnership to delegated power to citizen control. And it's a useful mnemonic, useful visual for talking about forms of participation. And you might ask in your community, how far up the ladder do you go in your community with respect to participation in social change? I wanted to briefly make mention of what one of the things that I'm doing these days to try to support participation for a more inclusive planet. We're developing an initiative that we call the CoDesign Commons. And CoDesign grows out of a design philosophy that emphasizes participation and goes as high up the ladder as we can. I'm going to read something here that I've written, so it's a little bit more scripted. Traditionally and currently, the design of new environments, services, and technologies for our society is based upon a cultural premise of individual autonomy. This includes a strong focus on the individual aging body, and I would also suggest much of our focus is on the individual body with a disability. And it suggests that successful aging or overcoming disability comes from taking personal responsibility, often discharged through the convenient consumption of the products of a massive gerontological, medical, commercial complex, dependent upon the expertise of design, development, and service professionals. The individual needs of older adults and people with disabilities are fulfilled by silos of design and production targeted to isolated elements of the body: skin, hair, energy, strength, cognition, etc. Now, this model is coming under criticism based on the emerging belief that the so-called problems of, indeed, the very experience of aging and or disability is embedded not in the individual body, but in its network of relationships with the social, cultural, and physical environment. This new approach problematizes aging and disability through the development of a focus on the connectedness, not the isolation of the aging person or the person with a disability. It operates from this emerging paradigm and seeks to apply a design with, not a design for approach to our society. While it does not envision the erasure of attention to, nor the need for expertise in research and design, there's still a role for the experts. It suggests an alternative form of design and practice more aligned with the phenomenal experience of aging and disability, better understood, importantly, through a deeper collaboration with those whom the system is meant to support. But by designing with an aging society or people with disabilities, not an aggregate of aging individuals or people with disabilities, the CoDesign Commons, this organization that initiative that we're trying to get off the ground, seeks to help designers, planners, and entrepreneurs to head off significant design mistakes, improving existing technologies to serve a broader market, and innovate new aging in place environments, services, and technologies to serve a changing world. And on the slide, I show our logo, which is two figures, green and gray, facing each other in a common pursuit. The issue of the commons is important to the work and draws from the work of Nobel Prize winning political scientist Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom is from Bloomington, Indiana University, and first woman economist to receive the Nobel Prize in, non-economist to receive the Nobel Prize in economics. She's credited with acknowledging the capacity of local groups and communities to solve their own problems of governance in the creation of sustainable economic and social systems. Going against the grain of mainstream microeconomics, she debunked the concept of the tragedy of the commons, a theory which argued that common properties will always be exhausted when individuals maximize their own interests. It would argue that a common oceanic fishery, for example, would ultimately be depleted due to the assumed fact that every fishing boat will attempt to maximize its own profit at the expense of others. Over her career, she demonstrated over and over again that, to the contrary, common properties are and can be sustainably governed by users themselves without the imposition of formal systems designed to negotiate across differing interests. And I think this is important, practically speaking, in communities where different groups are competing for scarce resources, and the officials think of it as a zero-sum game where one group advances to the detriment of another, and that's a kind of a non-commons way of looking things. I'm going to come back to the notion of the commons in a story at the end of my talk. So if you're interested in the CoDesign Commons, we're just getting off the ground. Our website actually is still under construction, but you're welcome to view our website at codesigncommons.org if you get a chance, and we would appreciate any thoughts or suggestions or comments that you might make about its content, its design, its accessibility, and so forth. I'm still learning with the assistance of Peter and Claudia at the Great Lakes Center. I've learned a lot in this webinar about some of the assistive technologies embedded in Zoom. Found that very helpful. So if you, as a community, decide that participation is important, then of course we have to ask the question, who participates? And here I turn back to another sort of famous model, Revan's triangle, where if you're trying to promote community change, you really have to involve people that know about the issue, people that care about the issue, and people who can actually do something about it. I live in a town where we spend a lot of time talking about what needs to change, and they never include people who can actually do something about it. So in Bloomington, we a number of years ago, through the Center on Aging and Community, now the Center for Health Equity, we organized an event to try to support the participation of people with disabilities in an examination of our downtown walkability. And I think there's maybe a live link in your chat box, or Claudia can provide it to you, which is a YouTube created by Peg Holtz, and I think I have the names of my other, I thought I had a slide with the other team members' names, Jenny Todd and Matt Norris and Sharon House and a number of people did a wonderful job putting together this walkability assessment. And essentially it was that, it was a walkabout with about, I don't know, 15 or 20 people with disabilities, a diverse set of disabilities, looking at their relationship to the downtown environment. And we sure learned a lot from it. So this is a photo, the current slide is a photo of one of the groups, one of the red team or the blue team, looking at their clipboard, which was a guide to the exercise in examining the downtown environment. And another group, probably, I guess the blue team maybe, identifying a particular barrier that was problematic in our downtown area, which was parking that extended over the walkway in front of a couple of businesses. Really kind of a silly thing because it pushed the pedestrian or the person in a wheelchair out into the street. And those are the kinds of barriers, both minor and major, that the group identified and recorded and then reported on in a meeting at City Hall. I wish we had had more government officials in this particular meeting, but we did have a number of interested and committed people who were concerned about the problem, not as many people that could actually do something about it. So this is a photo of Kyle reading a summary of the assessment that the group he was involved with conducted in the exercise. Now, for our particular assessment, we had people from a number of different communities participate. And we did not really have a follow-through plan. We should have really thought more deeply about that going into it. But in and of itself, it was certainly a useful exercise. It was an awareness builder for the people that participated in it. We're just not sure how far it carried into their home communities. With that in mind, we decided what would it take to do a longer term change project looking at livable communities. And through the Center for Health Equity, formerly Aging in Community, our team of people put together a wonderful training program called Advocates for Livable Communities, Working Together for Change. The cover of the training workbook is shown on the slide, and as is a link to the PDF version of the workbook. You're all encouraged to use that as much as you can for whatever purpose. The whole project was created by Jenny Todd, Peggy Holtz, Jane Harlan Simmons, Matt Norris, and Sharon Baggett, who is with the University of Indianapolis, a gerontologist now who's with the Center for Aging and Community in Indianapolis, living in Oregon. So the training program extended from 2013 to 2017 with funding from the Indiana Governor's Council for people with disabilities. We had 114 participants from 6 different communities. We went into 6 different communities, I should say, and each community we spent 5 days over a period of a month or 2 developing the training, which was delivered to all those participants. It happens, and there was some intention in looking for what in Indiana at the time were called stellar communities. And I think 5 of the 6 communities were official stellar communities. And this was a major Indiana government community redevelopment program that provided huge grants for built environment change and services in communities in Indiana, a very competitive grant program. So it made sense to try to align with those communities where they were already making some changes. A lot of time was spent with kind of the advance work to develop the project. We had to develop local planning committees. Since we were out-of-towners, it was very important to have a local committee take responsibility for recruitment, identifying stakeholders and inviting them to participate, for the logistics, arranging for meals and space and so forth, and for local media coverage, both before and after the event. And we paid stipends to participants, we felt this was very important for people with disabilities who were working in, say, sheltered workshops, making very little money. We'd be asking them a lot to volunteer to come to this training. And typically, you know, if we were doing this training for professionals, they would be paid to be there. And that was not true for the participants in this program. So we gave them stipends, and we also funded personal care assistants or other helpers that they might have needed to participate in the program. We tried to pay attention to accessibility issues. The workbooks and the PowerPoints were formatted for people with visual impairments, sent 2 weeks in advance for screen readers or assistants. We employed sign interpreters. And as I mentioned, we supported personal assistants, including for people with cognitive disabilities, needing assistance in completing written assignments and to prepare for presentations. I hasten to add that half of each group were people with disabilities, including young people, and the other half were all older adults in the community. So what we were doing intentionally was bringing together older adults and people with disabilities participate in the training together and jointly. And this was kind of a surprise to me, but not to my colleagues who had been working in the disability field for a long time. And we initially, I went in, and so did Sharon, thinking that we needed to spend some time early on with icebreakers and other get to know you kinds of exercise to break down attitudes or stereotypes that particularly older adults might have about people with disabilities, about working with people with disabilities. And I was surprised. We were all delighted that those bridges were crossed within the first few minutes of the first day. It was very clear that they saw themselves coming together for something, and the barriers across aging and disability just vanished. They evaporated as soon as everybody was in the same room. Overall, the training focused on two domains or two tracks, if you will. One had to do with knowledge and best practices, increasing knowledge about issues and what could be done about them. And the other, importantly, about advocacy skills. In other words, how could they become community advocates? And so with respect to the knowledge and practice issues, there were specific sessions on mobility and housing and social and cultural opportunities, health and support services, recreation, education, employment, and civic engagement. Advocacy skills involved training around the idea of educating, uniting and collaborating, speaking out, engaging, and serving. And here's the Venn diagram again. For the advocacy skills that became a very, very important part of the training. This is a slide with photos of public transit, walking and rolling, and bikeability, three of the mobility options that we focused on in the training. I have to go a little quickly here as I look at the clock more quickly. There were homework assignments over the period of 5 days. This was 5 days over several weeks, actually. And in a couple of instances, there were 2 weeks between sessions to give people an opportunity to do homework assignments that might have included walkability assessments in their own community or examining current policies in their community around some of these issues. And a second homework assignment related to advocacy, creating a worksheet to identify stakeholders and creating an example script for describing issues and recruiting help. We brought it all together in the very last day, where 35 people came to receptions, including mayors and United Way people and clergy and housing administrators. And our participants made a pledge on the last day, both as individuals and groups, and a pledge to come to a follow-up reunion where we could reflect on the process. The evaluation of the program provided evidence of actually significant positive change on self-reported knowledge and skills. The kinds of questions that were asked, for example, I understand how the physical design of my community affects my health and the health of others. I can describe the concept of livability. The pre-post changes around those statements was quite good. We also did a second survey to evaluate the training quality for our own benefit. And then we looked at the impact of the training also, more practically speaking. And this is a table on the slide that shows, is drawn from an article that was published about what people did after the training to follow up. That included serving on committees, making a TV or radio appearance, making a presentation to a church, testifying at a public hearing, those kinds of things. And some practical outcomes included one community expanded its community coalition, Healthy Community Coalition, to include trainees. One group worked with people maintaining a softball field to improve accessibility. One developed and received funding to establish a micro loan program for a sidewalk repair. One group developed a one-day program on improving accessibility for churches and delivered that to 2 statewide conferences of United Methodist Women. One group engaged a mayor in a tour of their local park, and another group brought legal action against a local business to force compliance with the ADA. Some months later, weeks later, we had some more funding from the Governor's Council to do a summit. And we did a grant competition for communities that participated, seeking a $5,000 grant for particular projects. And the slide describes the nature of the competition, called 5x5, and two of the winning submissions. So some of the conclusions for the training, it's quite possible to create bridging capital across aging and disability. We had moderate success in organizing people to identify issues around livability in their communities, success in creating cooperative connections across age and ability, and success in not focusing only on technical training, but doing training that included attention to the participants' assets, their personal experiences, and their stories. And along with the homework became a very, very important part of the training to make it more experiential, less didactic. I can't say that we achieved what Saul Alinsky and the Industrial Areas Foundation might call ultimate long-term success, in that the communities did not establish a long-term framework for change. So one could anticipate a drop-off of organized action in the absence of long-term support. And in the long term, the bridging capital may be lost in a training program. So that's a very important and perhaps the most difficult aspect of promoting community change. I wanted to pay quick reference to another movement that some of you probably know about, called the Dementia-Friendly Community Movement. Some of this comes out of redefining dementia as a disability and not as a disease, as you might guess. There are now 2 national organizations, Dementia Action Alliance and Dementia Friendly America, that are developing this model of livability for people with dementia in their community. And I just wanted to call that to your attention, something you might be interested in looking into or might already know about. I just skipped one of the visual now how do I go back? This is a visual that describes the dementia-friendly community movement in more detail with a picture, a diagram of a dementia-friendly community, but I don't want to dwell on that. I want to tell you a story about Kamikatsu Cho. Peter, is it okay if I go on a little bit longer? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's fine.
Many of the principles espoused in the theory of the commons are manifested in the remarkable story of the comeback of a distressed community in the mountains of Japan. Where Japan is the country with the oldest population in the world, the village of Kamikatsu is super aged. It's called Genkai Shiraku, with over 50% of the population of Kamikatsu being older than age 65. When an agricultural agent arrived in Kamikatsu about 20 years ago, he found a community nearly devoid of young people, struggling to survive in the face of major declines in the forest industry and mandarin orange groves. In 1950, the population had peaked at over 6,300. In 1955, it began to decrease due to the dramatic outmigration of adults to surrounding cities. It's not unusual to see what we see in the Midwest. In 2010, the population had diminished to 1,700, 52% or more above the age of 65. And this agent was charged with developing experimental agricultural products, but he was not having much success. One day he was on a visit to Kyoto, and he happened to in a restaurant in Kyoto, and he happened to overhear a group of young women at a nearby restaurant table. They were ecstatic about the leaves that the chef had used to decorate and garnish their kaiseki, a traditional multi-course Japanese dinner. The agent experienced an epiphany, realizing that the mountain communities he worked with were replete with these products. While he encountered resistance when he got back, the old women said, "Leaves are not products." He persevered and supported a small group of elderly entrepreneurial women to collect and prepare leaves and branches for shipping to Kyoto. It seemed that this was an industry eminently suited to employ older women, so knowledgeable about local and seasonal flora. You would call that asset-based development. By 2005, 300 kinds of leaves were being shipped from Kamikatsu town with an annual revenue exceeding almost $3.5 million. I won't give you the yen, accounting for more than 80% of the product being sold at the Osaka Central Warehouse. 20% of all households participate in the industry, and the average age of the people engaged in collecting, washing, and packing leaves is 68 years. The monthly household income now ranges from $2,500 to $3,750 a month, $33,750 a month, with exceptional households earning substantially more than that. What's even more remarkable about the story is the cascading accomplishments achieved. A wireless fax system originally designed for natural disasters was repurposed as a tool for communicating news of current market preferences and specific orders of leaves to the elderly agriculturalists. A volunteer taxi service serving the many elders who are isolated in outlying areas was repurposed as a product delivery system, getting leaves to town center for distribution. A work-related newsletter expanded to become a popular vehicle for news of social events and opportunities. An existing structure of neighborhood councils became energized as elders offered ideas for improving the town and creating a, quote, clean community. This spawned a recycling program that increased the town's recycling rate to 80% compared to 19% in Japan overall. Kamikatsu became a leading exponent of zero waste for the entire country, attracting young people to visit, study, and occasionally take up residence. The town recycling center evolved into a maker space where elders gathered to repurpose used items and enjoy the sociality of common work. A small grocery expanded its offerings of homemade foods, accompanied by recipes and instructions for using leaves as a garnish. And perhaps the most significant accomplishment was reflected in elders' comments that they came to exist, quote, with visible faces. They exist with visible faces. They're not invisible anymore. And all this was accomplished without reference to any concepts of age friendliness or livable communities, but rather to the simple recognition that old people have valuable knowledge and significant physical capacity. And on the slide, there's a photo of Kamikatsu Village, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous mountainous area of Japan, a beautiful place to live. And that's what I call livable community development. I'm going to skip the next slide in the interest of time, which is a brief diagram and photo of what Dan Buettner has called blue zones. And these are places around the world where there's an exceptional longevity. And he has done research on the factors that lead to the longevous populations in those areas. And he started with 5 of them ranging from Okinawa to Loma Linda, California, which has a large population of Seventh-day Adventists. I think it's also important to pay attention to the intangibles, not just the concrete built environment. And this should be part of the work of Livable Communities development. And this is a slide that shows balloons with intangible values illustrated: laughter, movement, choice, memory, beauty, and learning. Those become very, very important goals of the Livable Community movement as well. I'm ending with some quotes here. Examples of a livable community for old people. Christopher Alexander, the architect and author of A Pattern Language, would say, "A good community has old people everywhere." Cat Stevens, the singer, now Yusuf Islam, would ask, where are children in our environments? In his song, "Where do the children play?" If we can answer that question positively, and we know the answer, that children are everywhere, then that's wonderful. And from the disability community, of course, "Nothing about us without us," which is a great expression of total participation. And I'm ending with a quote from Wendell Berry on the notion of community, which becomes important. "To be healthy is literally to be whole. Our sense of wholeness is not just the completeness in ourselves, but also is the sense of belonging to others and to our place. I believe that the community, in the fullest sense, a place and all its creatures, is the smallest unit of health, and that to speak of the health of an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms." And I'm ending with that, which is a picture of Wendell Berry and a friend of his sitting on the back of their pickup truck with their favorite spaniel dog. And I've provided contact information in the last slide with a reference to my website and blog post that I have done for a long time, and then turn it back to Peter for some discussion.
All right, thank you very much. What a wonderful presentation, and lots of great information. I can say that I truly enjoyed it, and let's be honest, that's why we're here, to make sure that I am entertained. A quick mention about the video that Dr. Stafford had mentioned towards the middle of the slide, and that project. The link to the YouTube clip is available in the handouts. If you were unable or did not have an opportunity to download, save the handouts prior to the session, those handouts will be posted when the archive of today's session is posted approximately 24 hours following the end of today's session. So you'll be able to go back and get the handout and access the the link to that YouTube clip. It's interesting, and would encourage you to go and take a look at that. So at this time, you can continue to submit your questions in the Q&A area. I sort of wanted to start out with a little bit of a discussion with you, Dr. Stafford. I was very interested in you highlighting when talking about the ADA and talking about minimums and universal design. I think you could also phrase it as usability, right? Because the ADA accessibility standards that are part of the civil rights law set minimum requirements, and we know that a new building could be constructed that fully complies with the ADA accessibility requirements, but that building may not be usable by certain members of the community. So if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of livable communities. And while the ADA is a fantastic civil rights law, 30 plus years that it's been around, it's a great starting point, but right, not necessarily the end goal in terms of a fully livable, usable community for all.
And before you answer that, Phil, if you can leave it back on the question slide.
Yeah, let's see how I can do that. Should I hit
Click
open?
on slide 47 and then go to.
Oh, there we go.
And then
We'll stay. Yeah, and I'll prompt you when we need to go.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. I was wondering, I couldn't find the view thing. Appreciate that. Well, there was a wonderful article in the paper this morning by a woman who writes with autism, who writes a regular column, and her column today was referring to invisible disabilities. And this is an experience that she encounters in that she's very much of a participant in the downtown community and in the social life of the community. Has a service dog, but people are not aware of the nature of her disabilities and mistake the service dog as a regular pet. As a consequence, overcome the appropriateness of petting the dog. And it puts her into a situation where she may sometimes has to describe her disability to people who might not otherwise see it. And so accessibility as a challenge in the built environment needs to be, it can be very nuanced. And so communities need to dig deep into that concept just of accessibility to think through the implications of changes that they might be proposing. Because it's not just all about wheelchairs, which is, I think, sometimes the general notion in communities among citizens as well as officials. And the best way to dig deeply into accessibility, I think, is through participation. In other words, coming to know the lived experience of people with disabilities. And in order to more completely and intentionally design environments that draw upon that knowledge. That process, that kind of research and assessment, if you will, is as valuable to the notion of livability because that suffers from a nebulous kind of a understanding for people who have trouble manifesting what livability means in their community. I know a fellow who really talks a lot about Bloomington being age-friendly, but I kind of see it through a different lens sometimes, and I agree there are certain elements that make our community age-friendly, but in some ways he's basing his description on his own personal individual experience. And there are other people with other experiences, and you won't know those until you foster participation and collaboration. And so I think the participation is valuable to both the accessibility and the livability questions. Accessibility, I think, provides the opportunity to broaden the discussion to livability. In fact, this comment I made about where you may have an accessible door, but where do you put it on the building, is an opportunity to change the discourse around accessibility to livability by avoiding the mistake and buying into the notion that as long as you have a compliant ramp, you're just fine. And so it can be challenging. It's unfortunate if only one person in the community is singing that song, but that's another a problem with a lack of participation that sometimes occurs.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, the ramp concept, and you talked about the the ADA, a positive having a maximum slope for ramps and curb ramps at 1 to 12, but that can be very steep for certain individuals, and not just individuals that use wheelchairs, but individuals with respiratory conditions, older individuals that use walkers, canes, or crutches.
Yeah.
That can limit participation. A question about suburbia and livable communities within suburbs. Suburbs, a lot of suburbs are built around the ability to get somewhere by vehicle. Lots of large roadways, long portions of corridors lined with big box stores and limited sidewalks to be able to get there by bike, by foot, by my wheelchair. And have you come across any areas that have been able to transform themselves from a destination by vehicle only into a more livable community?
Well, change has been occurring at two levels. One is at the level of urban planning, and the philosophies and practice of urban planning. Much of this has grown out of the new urbanism movement, initiated largely by Dwayne Plater Zyberk firm in Florida, but now taken up all over the country, all over the world through the Congress of New Urbanism. And this is a planning philosophy that emphasizes mixed use development and other forms of planning and zoning that zone away from the traditional suburban model, trying to create downtown centers and more livable environments. And so there's change happening at that level, and I think new people coming into the field are learning about that and getting on. There are also change happening on the ground, and one person who is kind of the guru of retrofitting suburbia is Ellen Dunham Jones, who's from Georgia, who has written a book, I think just a new edition of a book by that name, that provides wonderful examples all over the country of suburbs that have been retrofitted, sometimes for aging in place, and usually with attention to many of the kinds of issues that you just brought up relative to mobility and access to services and so forth. So there are a lot of good examples popping up around the country that the participants today can get access to. You can look at the Congress for New Urbanism website. I belong to an organization called International Making Cities Livable, and we have had over the last 25 years 55 different conferences with that title in the U.S. and in abroad. And each conference is remarkable in bringing together 200 or 300 people with creative people with significant experience on livability and the built environment. There are usually papers on accessibility and disability and aging also. And I'm pleased to say that the conference is going to be in Carmel, Indiana this year, June 8th to 12th. Registration is still open, and it's a fairly long conference, like 4 days, but extremely thrilling and exciting, and I encourage people to look into that. I wish it didn't cost so much to go to it, but it's going to be our first in-person conference. Last year it was canceled because of the pandemic, but this year it's back into an open person-to-person environment, and the main hall for the conference is this incredible performance hall that the city of Carmel, which used to be a traditional suburb, and is now a city, livable city, is performance center, which will allow people to sit apart from one another sufficiently. So I encourage people to do that. So there's really a lot happening around the country and around the world, and that's one of the reasons I have trouble keeping up with the livability movement, because there's so much going on. And you can start on about any issue and follow that thread to something that you would find interesting and worthwhile. I do regret sometimes that the field of architecture spends a good deal of its attention to retirement community design, and there are competitions for that purpose, and that's, I have to say, that's where a lot of the income, the revenue is these days, designing retirement communities, sometimes gated communities, and continuing care retirement communities. And that's all well and good. There are two things. First of all, I wish those architects would get into redesign of urban and suburban communities for aging in place and for people with disabilities. And secondly, use that experience to teach others and use what they've learned from designing retirement communities that can be applied to, if you'll forgive me, more traditional, real, and less intentional communities.
Is something you said early on in your answer stuck out to me, and that was zoning, and I'd never thought of that being a significant barrier, especially in suburbia. If you could just talk about that a little bit more and how that can impact livability.
Yeah, sometimes it's zoning. Perhaps more often it's covenants in neighborhoods that restrict lot sizes, restrict the kinds of things that might be done to change the appearance of a home or cause problems for somebody if they want to build a ramp on the front of their house. Having to undergo some stigma in doing that in a suburb that's supposed to look in correct fashion, and these are hard to change because they're not in law and not part of public policy, not part of municipal policy, and they can be problematic as well. But zoning is another area where people can have impact. In Bloomington, we started by trying to literally increase the number of uses of the term aging in our comprehensive master plan. And we took a PDF of the original draft of the comprehensive plan and did a word search for aging and cognates. And then we did a lot of advocacy work to try to incorporate the attention to those issues in the comprehensive master plan, and went back and looked again, did a word count, and found that the word was much significantly increased in number in the comprehensive master plan. And more specifically, we got language into the plan around accessory dwelling units and the very phrase lifetime community in the plan and defined in the plan and applied to 2 areas that are subject to future development, where the lifetime community framework is called for as a planning framework. And now we're beginning work on the Unified Development Ordinance, which is the zoning ordinance. I wanted to say too that we got some universal design language into the comprehensive plan, and it wasn't in the plan. It was a later ordinance, I guess, that was passed that has universal design requirements under certain conditions, and we were thrilled to get that done. The other thing that we're trying to do is now to engage in the discussions about zoning with a focus on one zone in particular, which is the site of an old hospital that is relocating, and we think provides an opportunity to develop a lifetime community as a part of the zoning framework for that neighborhood. It's now called a medical zone, but we hope to expand the attachments to that zoning category with some other incentives and requirements around lifetime community. So that's an important area of public policy that livable community advocates need to be involved with as well.
All right, we are near the.
I'm sorry, there's one question. The name of the book about urbanism that I mentioned, it's called Retrofitting Suburbia, and it's by Ellen Dunham Jones. That's hyphenated, and she's let me think, Georgia Tech or Georgia State. I always forget.
Thank you. That's what I was going to ask you. All right. Thank you very much, Phil. And the the zoning, it demonstrates, going back to your the different models of livable communities and how people can become involved in different aspects of it. So great information. Thank you very much for that presentation. If you could advance to the next slide, slide 48. for me, please. Session evaluation, you will receive an email following today's session. We encourage you to complete the evaluation. That feedback helps us in planning future sessions, so please take a few minutes to complete that evaluation for us. On to the next slide, slide 49. We have a special session coming up on Wednesday, March the 24th. That session will focus on access to vaccines for people with disabilities and barriers that are preventing people with disabilities from getting access to the COVID vaccines. We have Andy Imparato, Executive Director of Disability Rights California, as well as Nancy Horton with the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, who will be presenting. And then our last slide, please fill slide 50. The next scheduled session of the regular ADA audio conference program will be on April the 20th. That session will be with Rex Pace, looking at the General Services Administration and enforcement of the Architectural Barriers Act. You can find registration information, full session descriptions, and speaker information for both of those upcoming sessions by visiting ada-audio.org. Again, today's session has been recorded. The recording as well as the handouts will be posted within 24 hours at ada-audio.org. So one last time, a big thanks to Dr. Stafford for his presentation today and lots of great information. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at a future session. Take care.
Thank you.